Welcome one and all to a new episode of MyRPG Podcast. Today's episode, we've got Elias Thompson. Elias is a good friend of mine who, as well as making internet content, also produces and stars in the online RPG show Realms of the Wild, which is based out of the Zelda Universe channel. So in this episode, we talk about what it takes to produce the show, put together the party, dynamics such as that, and of course then being a player and producer. Hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome one and all to a new episode of MyRPG Podcast. Today's episode is featuring our friend Elias Thompson. Elias, will you please introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Elias Thompson, as I have previously introduced, and I am a producer and cast member on the Zelda Universe Zelda RPG show Realms of the Wild, amongst 50 billion other things. But that's what I am relevant to this podcast.
Yeah, and not to pigeonhole him, but we are going to talk specifically about your RPG experience with Realms of the Wild, as well as your own RPGs in your own time. So, since that's our topic, and that's the name of the podcast, Elias, what's your background with RPGs? How did it all start for you?
I feel really pigeonholed right now. Yeah, RPGs. So I've been kind of a product of this sort of new age. I don't know, consider it like a D&D renaissance that I guess sort of started with the inception of 5e back when D&D Next was getting beta tested. A mutual friend of ours who I believe you've had on the podcast already, Trainer Jody, shortly after I met him and I met you and a few other folks, he invited me to an online game. I think it was a parody game. That was the first one, where he's just like, hey, it's for this event. I need players. Are you interested? And I was just like, sure, why not? Don't know what I'm doing, but seems interesting. So he made a whole character for me and just like gave it to me, and I did my best. But ever since that, it's just been a bit of a slow roll ever since then. I would regularly play in that game like once or twice a year. Eventually got kind of a home game going on, which is sort of once a month ish. And then as I started to take on other projects of sorts in my life, especially in relation to the Zelda Universe Twitch channel. One of the ideas I had early on was to do a Zelda RPG because it's not really anywhere else. And everyone else who was involved with the channel loved the idea, and so we sort of fast-tracked it. So I haven't been doing sort of tabletop role-playing games that long, but I did a lot of theater in high school, and that sort of mindset really sort of helped. It was something I could take to the table, you know.
I find a lot of people who have a theater background are kind of well positioned to get into D&D or just any RPGs in general because of the communicative storytelling aspects, and also the fact that very few of us ever do come in with written lines into our games. So improvisation is probably one of the biggest things you can have when getting into RPGs.
Oh no, dude! I script my entire session. Are you kidding me? I script everything I say.
Man, your prep time must be ridiculous.
I spend 2 weeks for a 1 week preparation session. No, improv is a nice tool to have in that respect, and it was a little interesting for me at first because there was a significant gap between the theater I did in high school and the first time I did it. It would have been, I want to say 6 or 7 years since I last did any really theatrical or really acting kind of work. And so it was nice to sort of reacquire that muscle memory, so to speak.
Yeah, and I'm assuming, the transition, obviously learning new rules and new skills and things like that associated with the system, but the transition is probably a lot more fluid or more seamless if you just remember, back to your acting and improv days of like, okay, somebody's going to kind of go on a route and you're going to follow them in accordance with the general idea of a character you have. So yeah, I can see where the two and two are very synonymous. But before getting into like, and you said it was D&D, and we both actually got into D&D through the same person, Trainer Jody, our friend. Did you have like any sort of RPG, high fantasy background or anything like that at all as well? Because I find a lot of people, before they ever do a tabletop RPG, they will of course have played like a Final Fantasy or an RPG video game on the PC or something like that.
Oh, sure. I watch tons of movies like that. Lord of the Rings comes up in my mind. I produce a Zelda RPG show, and that comes from being a Zelda fan from a very, very long time. I was exposed to that video game series for almost as long as I've just known about video games in general. So that's been a pretty consistent sort of fantasy gaming related sort of just series that I've known about and been a fan of for a very long time. And so, like any time I think, of fantasy, in fact, freshman year in high school, my first theater class I think our final was to write and produce a play. And I wrote mine basically like a movie script because I have a problem. But it was this like high fantasy setting that was, took cues from The Legend of Zelda pretty much. And so, I think across my life that was a big influence, I would say. And it's really interesting that it's kind of come full circle where I played these fantasy RPGs for a little while and then was able to help get a Zelda RPG on the web.
So you did mention when you got into your first RPG that the character was kind of given to you. I just want to know generally when you play an RPG, video game, tabletop or otherwise, do you want the character to be a representation of yourself, or are you 100% playing the character? And what I mean by that is in a lot of games now we get, customizable armors, cosmetics, things like that. And I know a lot of people who want their character to be kind of synonymous with who they are in real life. And then on the inverse of that is I know people who are like, well, it's a video game, so it's a character, so I just going to do whatever the character or the world calls for. So it's, maybe playing a different gender or playing a different personality other than your own. Is it like that for you when you play RPGs?
It depends on the scope of the RPG, I think. So if I'm given like a single RPG, like technically this is an RPG, so I'll use an example, but the Pokemon series, you sort of, especially in the more modern ones, you can really customize your character a lot. But you're given one character to use in a single save file, right? And so, that applies to, I don't know, I can't think of any at the moment, but a lot of other RPGs where you get one character that you use for the whole game. And so for those, it'll basically be a version of myself that looks cool in relation to the world that it's in. Or,
And I think it's great that you mentioned Pokemon, because if anything, I believe Pokemon's like the perfect like RPG light. Like before you get somebody into Final Fantasy or before you get them into like D&D or anything like that, or an MMORPG like, a WoW or Aeon or whatever of your various ones, to see if they like the mechanisms that are inside of Pokemon. And then if they do, I think you'll have an easier transition.
Yeah. And then on the converse side of that, my MMO poison of choice is Star Wars: The Old Republic. And you can have, I think, up to 16 characters on a server. My main on that, so to speak, is sort of likewise again. I chose a cool race, and then it's basically just a kind of Jedi representation of myself, right? But then, I also want to make other characters with other classes, and those are very different. I don't really play on any RP servers on that game, but they make very different like story choices. That's a very story driven MMO. And so they make very different things that I would not, me would never, do. Like I have basically a dark side version of my main character, which, does dark side stuff, but in some kind of the me way. And then I have, half of the characters are female, so that changes things a little bit. So, I guess it depends on the scope of the game, but I think my default setting is definitely to err on this sort of self-insertion kind of aspect, for sure.
So you've started playing RPGs then, as we're going chronologically through, and what was the means in which the party was put together? Was that just kind of haphazardly, or was that chosen amongst friends, or how did all that come together? And also, how did you figure out what sort of role you fit in the party dynamic? And what I mean by that is, for everybody here, is you very quickly you'll find out in any sort of party, like if there's a very let's say a bold or forward person, then you're probably going to try to maybe, if you want to compliment them, you could try to be that way, or you can recognize that that person has kind of that slot taken care of, or that kind of personality point taken care of. So you kind of pick something completely different, because nobody wants 5, bards who are all entertaining themselves. Though I've heard of bard-only games and they're pretty cool, but I think you want a different dynamic. So how do your parties come together, and how did you figure out your role in the dynamic?
Yeah, for Realms, right?
Yeah, for Realms, and also going into like any of your previous games that you play on your own.
Okay. For previous games, that sort of first one was just sort of a generic fighter with a soldier background that was given to me. And I play him very rarely, that I'm still kind of figuring out his character even this many years later. But that was a good sort of just intro to sort of get my feet wet into what this would be like. Eventually, I would put a lot more time into that. With Realms, with my character in Realms of the Wild specifically, we did have an audition process for that, because we knew it was going to be a show from the beginning. Sometimes you can have a game that you do privately, and then people sort of agree, like, oh, maybe we should make this a stream or a content of some kind online. And then you pretty much already have your party where your dynamic and stuff. This was a sort of new RPG show that we were forming for the purposes of broadcasting. So we did have auditions. For the most part, they were private. Private both within Zelda Universe as an organization, as well as sort of our expanded networks of the producers on the show. And so we held auditions. I was convinced to audition by the other producers, because at the very least one of them knew. Trainer Joni is the game master on that, and so he had seen me roleplay before, and he asked me to audition. I took myself out of the casting process for that as a producer for myself, but I just came up with a quick little character for the audition, which, for those unfamiliar with Realms of the Wild, it's a Zelda RPG set in the Breath of the Wild period of the super convoluted timeline, where there's about 100-year span that the game talks about right before the events of the game, where it's very post-apocalyptic and not a lot is seemingly happening. And so our campaign takes place within that 100-year period. For Breath of the Wild, because that's the most relevant game. A lot of newer Zelda fans, it was sort of a decision made there. But the audition games were done in the time period of Ocarina of Time, classic Nintendo 64 first 3D Zelda, right? And so that changed a few things whenever you're coming up with an audition character of, okay, it's got to be a race that was around that time. It's got to do that. So I came up with this Goron guy really, really quickly, because I was, busy, trying to organize the show and produce. I was just like, yeah, it's a Goron. He likes bombs. Yeah. And I just sort of filled in the rest during the audition process, as we went. And eventually the other producers decided that I should be in the cast. And once we formed the rest of the cast, we got a sense of the characters they would play, right? And there's what ended up being is there's one that's very, very curious, inquisitive about sort of, ruins and technology and stuff. There's one that's very sort of full of herself, on the erring on the kind of the royal, like, stuck up side. There's one that's like an ex-soldier that's puts on a lot of bravado, but has a lot of stuff going on underneath. And so that sort of left the door open for, I was thinking of making a new character for the actual campaign, should I have been cast. But once I sort of got a sense of the other characters, I was like, well, this Goron, who really likes bombs and has a few loose screws, seemingly is I think would be a good, fit for the party. And I think everyone else agreed with that, having seen how I played him in the audition process. So that was sort of how I decided to sort of go that direction with that character, bearing in mind that assumed party dynamic.
Yeah, and what you're talking about here is an interesting take on something that, is kind of the topic we have going on. I kind of wanted to hit on with this episode, kind of putting a party together and then how do you create a good experience. And you're trying to do that, but not only create a good experience for everybody who's playing the game, but make it watchable and make it entertaining. Mm-hmm. And so when you're doing that, did you have like a paradigm, a template, a sort of overall, like, I know this works? Or did it really just come down to like people you liked and people you thought would interact with and gel well together?
Both. Like you said, we had to make sure that the party and the cast would get along, and both in and out of character. But we also had to make sure this was going to be, or had the potential to be, an entertaining show for viewers to watch. And so one of the things we did, immediately, probably even before we really started working on this, was we looked at some of the more successful RPG shows out there. Critical Role is a really good example because they have, professional actors that their characters, at least at the time we were playing this, were very, different from each other and diverse, and yet played well off of each other. And so that has proven to be a successful formula to A, have a good time amongst yourselves most of the time, and B, entertaining for people to watch. And a lot of that comes from, if you're having a good time yourself, people like to see that. And so, we kind of figured it would be a good idea to have, the Zelda series has a lot of different races naturally in it. So, having a good diversity of character races there, a good diversity of just how people are like, and one of my games, my home game, actually, it started off very much as like 4 or 5 just grumpy guys, just sort of, talking to each other and making quips to each other. And that was it. And so that's the kind of thing that can possibly turn viewers off, especially if that's how you start something off. Your first episode makes a big impression. And so, we sort of knew that going in, and I think everyone who was in the audition process, everyone who auditioned was also cognizant of that fact as well. There were some people that did change their characters through the audition, and some people who auditioned with one character and were cast and now play a different character. So, it was very interesting to try and juggle all those pieces, because those were a lot of pieces. And I believe everyone involved in producing the show, this was their first RPG show. Although I won't say that, because Trainer Jody does broadcast his games a lot. But this was a whole audition, put together, produced thing. So.
Tell me personally, this I know is a first RPG show for the people who involved, but do you personally yearn for people who have some sort of RPG background in general when you're putting together a party wanting to play a game? Or is that something that you don't care about, or you're actually trying to pull people in, like taking people with no experience whatsoever? Because I've mentioned this multiple times now with the vast majority of my guests, who tend to be GMs and DMs themselves, is that we all kind of become missionaries or evangels to the house of the RPG, where we intensely try to bring in people who haven't played but show any sort of interest. But for you, do you find it easier to play with people who have experience, or do you much prefer the challenges of somebody who's never done it before?
Both. If it's like a home game, that's where your new players are gonna live primarily, right? And that's really great. You're there and they're learning it, and yeah, as a player or as a DM, which I've DM'd once in my life, but that's really a good place to sort of foster that, and you can sort of see them light up as the games go on, and just be like, yeah, this is really cool. That is possible to work on sort of the produced show aspect as well. The reason we had auditions was because we were gauging people who were interested in being a part of the show, whether or not they had experience or not playing before. And then people who had played a lot before, and there was sort of a mix of that. One of the things that we saw with auditions was, in fact, one of the key things was, do they role play naturally or well enough with any given other character dynamic, or with themselves and the DM, that would make for a good show. That was something we had to think about. And so most of the time that lent itself to the people who had played before, because they were used to role playing. The other half of that, there were some people who had never sort of role played in a tabletop RPG before, but did again have sort of like a theatrical sort of background, and so they could sort of slide into that really quickly and naturally. So yeah, so for like home games and stuff, it's really cool to see new players who are just sort of coming out of their shell, so to speak. To just sort of see that is really cool. On a show on the show we were producing, though, we had to sort of cast what would work well as a show, and that often lent itself to people who, at the very least, had some kind of improv experience before.
Yeah, so I have this quote from one Felicia Day by means of Ryan Day, who I had a conversation with at SDCC once, which was, the things that work on the internet, the things that get all the massive views, are either absolute virtuosity, like mastery of the content or the craft or the skill that is being shown, or absolute buffoonery and absurdity and humor, comedy based off of that. So I think, not saying new people are comical or buffoons, but there comes from being new kind of so many of these mistakes and funny situations. I think in your situation, though, you kind of have to err on the side of mastery, or at least having comfort with that, to really hit one of these two complete extremes in this quote, at least. Right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if any of us are masters, so to speak. Well, Jody maybe, but yeah, definitely we aired more on the sort of experienced players. I think there was one final cast member who didn't have a whole lot of tabletop RPG experience before, but they were one of the people who sort of slid into being able to improv well and role play well. But yeah, that, like, I mean, there are kind of two sides to that. There are successful shows, I believe, online where it's basically an experienced DM is playing with people who has never played tabletop role playing games before, and the show becomes about seeing them learn together, and it might even attract people who are interested that are learning with them. And so yeah, for Realms of the Wild, definitely we did go with what would be entertaining to see, and we felt it based on who auditioned, it would be more entertaining for people who could role play well, because that's what drew people in. We noticed from the shows that we studied.
Elias, you have a kind of unique situation being a player and a producer at the same time, because
yeah,
in the same way that a game master may be kind of conscientious of how many moments or how many opportunities each of his or her players is having in the spotlight, and maybe trying to either gear maybe an arc towards the direction of one or two characters, or maybe trying to then give a moment so the other people at the table feel like they're contributing. You, as a player, you shouldn't technically have to do that, but as a producer, you kind of have to do that. So do you ever find yourself kind of, and I don't know exactly how the storyline kind of frameworking template works between you and Jody, but would you ever find yourself noticing like, hey, this person hasn't been, speaking up recently or hasn't been participating? Maybe we should somehow get them involved, or do you kind of leave that all to the game master to figure that out?
So the way we kind of split that is both Jody and I are producers. There's a third producer who's more of like an executive because he oversees like all of media for Zelda Universe. But as the guy in charge of the Twitch channel, I'm one of the producers, and then Jody is the producer solely overseeing Realms of the Wild as a show. Once Jody sort of invited me to audition, and especially once it became more evident that I would be in the cast, Jody was, for good reason, very selective of what he told me about what he was planning. He pitched whenever, me and the other producer had to think about who we were going to get as a DM. And when we eventually talked to Jody, he pitched us sort of his idea for a campaign. And he was, he said enough of it to get us on board, but he did hold details back, in case either of us were in the cast, because he really didn't want to ruin that as a player, for good reason. And so, yeah, everything like narrative or sort of creative direction is purely Jody. The kind of producing I do is mostly just like, we have a 2-hour time slot. I try to make sure we fit into that as much as humanly possible. Stuff like, marketing the show, or finding a time slot for the show, or doing all these other extraneous kind of producer kind of things is sort of what I handle along with Jody. He has, as a producer, a say in that, and helps with that as well. But it's very much more of like an organizational aspect to that. The other thing I'll say is during the show, where I'm for most of the time in character, there are a few times where it's, so we have 3 of our cast who are on the West Coast, and on the West Coast our show airs at like 9 a.m. It can be rough some weekends for me especially, but sometimes, when a couple players don't have their coffee or something, the role playing or the game can sort of lull a bit. And there are a few times where I'm sort of in character, but then my producer mind sort of, kicks in the door and is just like, hey, what's happening now might not be, good content, so to speak, right? It might not make for a good show. And so that tries to barter with my in-game character mind of, what can my character do at this moment to try and change that? So yeah, it is really interesting to be both cast and a active producer on the show, for sure.
Well, agnostic of any realm stuff, just in general, and what you like to do you find yourself being some person who enjoys a heavy kind of role play base and likes to see a lot of prep from yourself as well as your players and cohorts around you? Or do you kind of like more loose and more casual gaming?
I mean, I just sort of roll with what the group really is into, or what the group's doing. I think I'm a little fortunate in that I feel like I can handle both, so to speak. If there's a lot of role playing going on and stuff like that, or if there's a really good opportunity for role playing like coming up or going on, then yeah, I'll dive right into that. Likewise, if it's a lot more of a casual thing, or if it's a more of like a technical, like maybe like more dungeon crawler kind of thing, where it's more like you're actually gaming and focusing on game mechanics, then yeah, that has its place too, and that I can do that as long as I know the system, if that's what the group is doing, so to speak. So yeah, in general, I feel like it's nice to be flexible to whatever the kind of game is as a player.
Yeah, and I think that dynamic actually comes from probably your prep. I mean, most games I typically have like either a prep document to give lore or just some sort of like lunch or quick chat session with my players, either individually or as a group, where I go, hey guys, this is kind of the game I like to play, kind of my division between like heavy RP and then more casual, how much combat versus how much role playing, how much strict adherence to rules versus how much lax rule of cool, as I call it, I like to have as well. So I think that's something that also does a real service to any sort of either show or campaign that you're going to run. Is kind of having that either session zero or at least that talk beforehand of figuring out what everybody wants from you. And then if there's any sort of like not misunderstandings, if there's any sort of situations to where the two don't exactly meet, then probably figuring out like where you can compensate or where you can work together on that.
Yeah. I've had two kind of different experiences with that as well. One with my home game, and then one with the show. The home game, your session zero can basically be the first session, where the first session it was a lot of our first sort of regular game, and so we were trying to figure out like what kind of game it was going to be. We had these characters that we made, and so we found our footing eventually. But you just sort of you explore, get a feel for what you want, and then you just start playing that game. Whereas for Realms, the show, we knew that it wanted to have a decent amount of role playing in it, and some nice character moments whenever the narrative called for it. And in order to do that, I mean, the audition process was really helpful in sort of just exploring how that can work, both between characters and with the players and the DM. But anyone who was cast, well, actually, in the auditions, Jody, he requested everyone who auditioned give at least a paragraph of backstory, just so that for this little 3-hour, test game, he could work backstory elements in there to see how they sort of reacted to it and stuff like that. For those that were cast, boy, did we have to provide a whole lot of backstory, which is good. We've seen some of that come out in the campaign and the show already, and so that kind of thing with, like you said, the amount of preparation. And Jody, he's one of the reasons we chose him as our DM is because he has a history of running these games that he gets all this backstory and blends it in really well to the campaign. And that's, something we wanted to see in the show as well. And so, we had about a little over a month from the time we announced the show to the pilot, and we had these sort of character reveals in the interim, and those character reveals came from just coming up with this backstory and working with Jody on finalizing that, and I think it's really made a big difference as opposed to what it could have been without that. Otherwise, you're just sort of kind of on rails, so to speak.
Yeah, and I mean, I had the for those listening and who don't know, I've actually guested on Realms of the Wild, thanks to knowing Elias and Jody and being good friends with them over the past few years.
Good
friends
is a word.
Good friends is a word.
I'm sorry, it's 2 words. It's 2 words. You're right. It's 2.
Okay, fair enough. Pedanticness aside, I've had actually the pleasure to guest in Realms of the Wild, and he requested the same thing, and he gave me the same breakdown that I would ask of any of my players. He kind of told me this is the type of game I like to run. I already watched the game and I was a fan, so that's fortunate. It did half the work for me, but he was like, just let's put this guy together. Let's come up with like a paragraph of why he exists in this world and what his position is. And then, I love your input. And for me, my favorite thing as a player is to kind of play simplistic characters, but I love puns. I'm kind of a dad joke aficionado.
Oh, so, I noticed.
So I had to, obviously, especially because it's based in the Zelda Universe, I had to make jokes about, vases and pots and breaking, and thus the name Brayek, which is just spelled as a weird phonetic way of saying break, was born. So I got to enjoy that as well. And yeah, that's something that I was benefited by giving the paragraph ahead of time, so at least I had a base of who my character was. And then I already knew the show, so I was kind of cheating in that regard. I already knew every character and how they interacted in every player. I just had to weasel my way into having a moment with everyone if I could.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up because that's sort of another aspect of the show is finding good points in the narrative to bring guest players on. And again, that's something that Jody largely handles because, again, he's sort of in charge. He knows where the narrative is going, and he knows the different branches it can take, so to speak. So he knows at what points and what places guest character opportunities could happen. And Don here was the first one. It's my understanding, he won't tell me too much for obvious reasons, but it's my understanding that he's still been in contact with you even after your appearance of what your character's doing. Spoiler alert, he lives past his appearance. And then he's apparently kept in contact with you of just like what you've been doing while we've been doing what we've been doing.
Well, as long as he confirms it, then I'm willing to say that, it's kind of really fun to get. And what's funny is I've done a very similar thing to someone. I didn't run a show or anything, but I through that first San Diego Comic-Con I ever went to, where I met Elias in person for the very first time, I happened to make a good friend who had just started, I think, 5e D&D at the time of that Comic-Con, and I just kept in contact with her over text, and after a while I found out that her own personal game had ended, but she had this tiefling rogue character that she liked a lot, and I was like, hey, do you mind if I throw that character into my game as just a nod to you, and she sounds like a fun character, so she was like, sure, yeah, throw her in. Lo and behold, the party takes a liking to her, and actually, as her own game is on hiatus or ends, and she's kind of moving around with life stuff, I kept this character Neri coming back in and out of my campaign. So I literally was doing that with her as well, about hey, here's what Neri's been up to, here's how she's been, here's how the party interacts with her, and it's kind of this really cool thing. I suggest to anybody out there, if you have anybody who's interested in playing, and maybe it's not necessarily going to be part of your campaign, or if your party's cool with having somebody jump in for a session, as long as they obviously are cool with it, bring them in and also make their character have a little spot in the universe. So then that person can also get the joy of seeing what people think of their character moving forward. And I've actually done something similar for Elias when he came to my hometown to jump in my Monday game, which was a lot of fun too.
Yeah, and we sort of kind of did the same sort of thing where after I did what I did there, we got the rundown of, okay, what would your character be doing over approximately this period of time? And so the door is open to have that character show up in an NPC capacity, or maybe a character capacity if I'm ever there again. And so that's I think something that's really a fun thing to do. Like you said, again, as long as everyone's on board with it. And but it's nice to see guest players and sort of guest people come into the group every now and then and just sort of shake things up a little bit and be like, oh wow, that's kind of different and that's cool. Hey, yeah, come back whenever the next opportunity arises. And we try to do a similar thing for Realms. We don't have guest players come on too often, but when the opportunities do arise, it's a really good opportunity to sort of just shake things up a little bit and get new faces on the screen for people to be like, oh man, this character needs to come back, or wow, this character, we should kill him off, or
Wouldn't that be great if I had a guest? I mean, actually, I take that back. I have had a guest at my table on my Sunday game who came in, and they survived the one shot because ideally, as a DM, unless you tell your players ahead of time that this is like a slaughterhouse grinder type one shot, in which case prepare to have your character killed. You'd like to at least let them get to the end of the adventure and experience everything that there is to be had. But in this case, she got to the end of the adventure, and then her whole all right, well, what's the epilogue for the one shot was like, no, I'm just going to attack the entire town. And I'm like, you're level 3. Yeah, but I'm going to attack the entire town. Like, Well, you managed to kill a few of them, and then the rest of them kill you. So, ta-da!
At least they got to the end.
Yeah, I mean, at least they got to the end of the adventure, but then got themselves promptly killed afterward, which actually I think is a nice, convenient way to like finish that character too, because now you don't have to worry about what happened afterwards. So that was actually a blessing in disguise.
Sometimes things work out that way for sure.
But yeah, speaking of interesting dynamics that shake up parties, you also have in your show, and correct me if I'm wrong if you've discontinued this, but kind of a voting rating system from the fans to say who they thought was kind of the MVP or did the best in the last episode. How's the idea come from, and what do you think it does to the game if it changes character interactions or playing? Sorry,
it definitely does affect the game. So yeah, we it didn't have too much initially, but as the show's been going on, we've been trying to think of how do we get people watching this show to feel like they're doing more than just watching. How do we make them feel like they're kind of a part of the game in some small way or in some way that they think is meaningful. And the way we started that was, at the end of every show on the Zelda Universe Twitter account, we say, hey, thanks for watching. Who do you think was the MVP of the episode? Whoever wins this poll will get something that's called a legend point in the system we use, which is Open Legend RPG. Great narrative-based system. I highly recommend it. And what legend points do is they can add like advantage to rolls and stuff if you spend one. And these legend points that are awarded from like chat participation don't follow quite as many rules as like a normal legend point. Like they can carry over from campaign. You can use them in situations where you normally can't use legend points. And so the winner of that MVP poll gets a special little chat legend point that they can use, and then that sort of made the chat feel like, oh, because we thought they did well, that gave them the extra push they needed to make this cool thing happen, or maybe it didn't and they still failed utterly. And so that's sort of how we started community involvement. We have kind of stepped it up a little lately. Twitch launched this great feature recently called extensions, which allow for a lot more sort of dynamic content to show up both underneath the player as well as on top as an overlay. There's one that the Zelda Universe channel uses where, one of the goals with the channel overall is to sort of just increase the number of live viewers. What Twitch channel doesn't have that goal. So one of the ways we do that is we award this sort of not currency called rupees, right? It's a Zelda channel, that you just accumulate only by watching live. So the longer you watch live, the more rupees you accumulate on this little extension. And then once you have enough, you can spend these rupees on things that affect, different streams. We have other streams on the channel, and there are things you can buy to affect those streams. But we have a sizable chunk for Realms of the Wild. You can use rupees to buy legend points for specific characters. You can buy potions or fairies to help heal people if they're like really on the edge, right? And then you get into like the higher, really, really expensive and hard to get stuff. You can work with Jody to design an NPC that will then show up in the game. And so that's really cool. And then the highest one, which has already been redeemed once, is a special episode, which is sort of, has a different theme. The first one was, much to my dismay, because I'm not a singer, a musical episode. Everyone in the cast except me is a good singer. And so everyone was on board with that idea. And then, kind of the whole Twitch culture thing where it's just like, oh, Elias, who runs the channel, doesn't want to sing in a musical episode. I'm going to save all my rupees and then buy this musical episode. So now we're planning a musical episode at some point. And so, those are just sort of different ways we've sort of figured out for the chat to sort of just affect in some subtle ways and some not so subtle ways the show and sort of be involved without having regular just doing things that are logistically implausible, or there's a word I'm thinking of that I'm sure you guys can put together, but it's been interesting for sure. It definitely that's another way things can get shaken up sometimes. And it's been fun and it's been interesting.
Yeah, and I mean the system which we kind of touched on briefly, but I think needs to kind of be brought up is Open Legend, and Open Legend's kind of, no pun intended, openness and kind of push towards the storytelling and less on the mechanics has this great kind of platform for you guys to incorporate into streaming, which I maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but I haven't seen too many streams, maybe aside from maybe a Hyper RPG one that used Open Legend, and I realized really quickly it completely lends itself well to broadcasting that online because of just the minimalization and the kind of the push towards being cinematic and iconic. So like the Legend Point system is literally encouraging you to do that, like take a chance, do something wild, and it then, of course, like you mentioned, ties into the way your audience participates as well. So bravo to the system, and bravo to you guys for implementing that.
Yeah, it's a really great system for telling a story, which Jody's telling a very massive, long story here, that he's sort of splitting up into different episodes. While like you said, there's not a whole lot of mechanics in the system. Like none of us have classes. We just sort of have these archetypes that we made up. But one of the mechanics is you just write down a couple of flaws your character has, right? And if you make a RP decision that utilizes one of those flaws, then oftentimes you'll get a legend point for doing that, because it's not as a player you're thinking this is not the best or this is not a good thing to do. But the character would do that, and so the character does that. And so that sort of allows them to, most of the time, get a legend point for that, which, can like I said before, I think give advantage to rolls and stuff. So it's really nice. It's a really nice system. Most of us, when we were thinking about the show, we considered D&D, but that was as nice and streamlined as 5e is still pretty mechanically focused, and we thought that especially considering the fact that we were telling a Legend of Zelda story, using a system like Open Legend really lent itself, like you said, the openness really lent itself to sort of just creating characters that existed in that world. And so I've had very little to no complaints with it for the show, and it's been a fantastic system to use for it.
Give me one moment that someone else has done something really, really cool that you enjoy a lot in any of your games. And then you can also throw in one that you've done yourself too that you remember fondly. Because I think anybody who's played RPGs, even one session, will have an awesome moment or a funny joke or a terrible failure that they'll always remember. So I'd love to hear people's versions of that. So give me one that you've done and someone else has done.
Well, okay. Wow, I've got to think back into the recesses of my brain here, but
I can give you a vamp. I'll vamp so you can get some time to think if you like.
Well, let's see. Something that's really cool that's happened so far. So yeah, in Realms, the first sort of boss encounter we had was a stone talus, and anyone who's seen or played Breath of the Wild, there's these giant rock, almost humanoid things that just sort of rise out of the ground, and they're rocks. Like, you can't do a lot of damage to them. And so this was a very tanky, first boss, and we were level, I think, 1. And because of time constraints, we kind of had to split the boss battle, where we, for the last hour of this, I think it was episode 3, we startled the boss and had to fight it. And because it was a giant boulder, basically, most of our attacks weren't doing a whole lot. And then it would just, throw us into a tree or something by flinging a rock or something. And so that was very much just like oh wow, we're in bad shape here. It's not looking good. I think one person was knocked unconscious at one point. We even had, for a little bit of the battle, like a group of NPCs that were sort of running interference, and they weren't helping much because it was just a giant boulder. Cut to the sort of second part of that where we picked it up in the first game, and there wasn't really any strategizing. It was just sort of just getting reminded of the scenario, and then somebody, one of the characters, was just like, "Oh wait, what if I tried?" And I'm having a hard time remembering exactly what it was, but they have something that's akin to a hook shot. If anyone has seen that in a Zelda game. And they did this weird thing where they like hook shot it on top of the talus and used like a tree thing. And they did like some massive critical damage that more or less just killed the boss. Like we spent an hour a week or 2 weeks before just doing minimal chip damage. And then they found some way to just like take most of the HP away instantly. And then the boss was pretty easy to finish off after that. So that was really cool, especially after being stressed for 2 weeks of just like, are we gonna die on this next episode? And there's been a few moments like that since then where I know me personally have been legitimately concerned for what's going to happen next. But the first time that happened in the show was definitely a memorable experience. As for myself, I would probably say there was we found ourselves in a dungeon basically in Realms of the Wild, and narrative things worked their way to where we were progressing basically from room to room linearly at one point. And we found ourselves in an empty room, and as anyone who's played mostly old school Zelda games could tell you, sometimes you'll be in a dungeon in an empty room, and then the tiles of the room will raise from the floor and start flying at you. Well, that's basically what happened to us. The difference was we weren't Link and couldn't just slash at them and they die. So we had to. There was some scrambling involved and reacting that was happening there. At some point, I looked at my sheet, and I'm slightly OCD in just that if I'm capable of doing like a bane or a boon, which is what Open Legend calls just sort of different things you can do, effects you can apply in either positive or negative way. If I'm capable of doing that with the stats I chose, then I want that just noted somewhere on the sheet that said, hey, it's possible to justify this thing that you can do. And so I looked down and saw that even though I'm like a bomb-happy like Goron whose main thing is just bombs, like that's it, I was capable of doing a barrier. I forget if it's a bane or a boon, but just making a kind of barrier. And so I was thinking, I was like, okay, how do I justify? I had like a turn to think about how I could justify this. And that's one of the cool things about Open Legend as well, is that if it plays into the rule of cool, if you want to try something, just explain what you're doing. And if it makes sense and it sounds cool, then let's do it. So I justified this whole, like, I sort of cut open a bomb a little bit and take like this black powder and spread it in this like, semicircle around most of the players here. And then just sort of light it on fire. And then these flames just sort of shoot up and it's blowing like hot air and just making upward thrust. So it's like an upward barrier. And I'm just sort of fueling it with more black powder to sustain the barrier as it goes on. And he was down for that. And that ended up mitigating a lot of tile damage for the most part. That helped us sort of, even in a very fast moving situation, sort of have us take a breath and get our thoughts together of how do we, take care of the rest of these tiles that are, maybe closer to us or stuff like that, or what can we do to about tiles that we can't mitigate, so to speak. So that was a moment that I was kind of proud of, where I was able to do more than just throw a bomb at something and hope for the best with my character.
And I'll throw in for me one of my moments, because I want to contribute and add something to the conversation here. Is I mostly GM, and I don't get to play as often as I like, but one of my favorite moments are when there's really unorthodox solutions to problems, and I remember in particular, I had my fight. One of the fighters in my games was in like a bare knuckle brawl for like some prize money or something, and all this other party members were kind of watching, and one of them happened to be a druid. And one of my favorite things was, as their fighter was like starting to teeter and get close to the edge there, like the cleric had done a healing word, which, in the fray of battle, there's all sorts of shouting and whatnot, so you can kind of get away with that, and you kind of see him get a second wind, and he kind of misses on both of his next attacks to take the other person down. It looks like, oh man, he's about to steal defeat from the jaws of victory. So the druid turns into, I think, a hawk or an eagle, and then ends up taking a crap, like rolled like a natural 20 to take a crap, which, real cool. I'm going to allow him to do that, to take a crap on the opponent's face, which distracts them and allows the fighter, to get the final blow. And just to see the people themselves crack up, me crack up at that moment was particularly great. And so that's like one of the 101 different moments I can kind of recall about all the parties I've run with and things like that are a lot of fun. So
as said fighter, I can corroborate this.
Yeah, I think it's kind of funny that this entire time, I'm pretty sure, I don't think you've been very kind as to not explain that I do run a game for you.
Yeah,
I'm
the home game I've been
so.
talking about is you're the DM. And
yes,
that definitely happened.
Everyone, that was the whole long con entire time. I just wanted to talk about my game.
Had that gone differently. I'm just not sure. I've actually almost died several times during that game.
Yeah, you do that a lot, but you know what? That's what makes for great storytelling. And everybody in that party, and this is going to tie into my next question, is this is a question, more of a comment. I find in any games I play, after a substantial amount of time, and substantial I mean is like 4 or 5 months plus, whether you only meet the person for 3 hours at a time, maybe once a week, 2 weeks, whatever, I don't think you can really play a game with people that you don't like. You don't have to be best friends with them. You don't have to like hang out and get drinks with them after the fact. But when you're spending 3 hours a pop, or 2 hours, however long your games are, with somebody consistently over and over again, if you don't like their character, that's okay. But if you don't like who they are in general, that makes it really hard to enjoy playing a game with them, I think.
And it's tabletop RPGs are really good for, you get a group together of bearable and eventually likable people. You do become friends in a lot of ways that come slower in other social situations. I sort of mentioned before that 3 of the Realms cast members live on the West Coast. One of those I knew of for the most part, but didn't really know. The other one I knew, but we weren't really close by any means. Now, we're friends. One of them is driving down to Southern California, where I live, and one of the other cast members live. And they're, we're going to hang out, grab lunch and stuff. And like, no one ever thought twice about that. And so they have a knack for pulling people together in a really profound way, for sure.
Yeah. RPGs do kind of bring people together, and it's kind of a great kind of cap for, why, if you can get the party experience and established, and you can get them kind of gelling together, that not only will you benefit from having a great game to play, I think you'll also benefit from having a potential set of new friends and people in your life.
Yeah, it's really nice.
Well, Elias, you've been talking about it this entire time about Realms of the Wild. So tell people how they can see it, how they can contact you as well.
Yes. So if you go to twitch.tv/Zelda Universe TV on your favorite internet web browser, you can find the Zelda Universe Twitch channel, where there's lots of different stuff that airs on that. But Realms of the Wild is the Zelda RPG show that airs currently every other Saturday morning at 9 a.m. Pacific, noon Eastern time in the American time zones. If you're not in America, you can time zone translate that to whatever you want. We actually have a widget on our Twitch channel, a little extension that shows show times in your current time zone, so that will help you. if you go there. And it's every other Saturday. I think that by the time this releases, it'll be not this Saturday, but the next one. Basically, you can follow at Zelda Universe on Twitter, and we'll always be tweeting what weekends they're happening and which weekends they're not. If it's not very discernible, but that is the time and place to be there. Shows last for about 2 hours, sometimes less, very rarely longer than that, but right at around 2 hours is usually how long they last. So it won't take too much of your time. Our DM Jody likens it to the return of Saturday morning cartoons, except it's a tabletop RPG on Twitch. As for myself, my name is Elias Thompson. My handles everywhere on the internet are also at Elias Thompson. I do manage that whole Zelda Universe Twitch channel as well. I have a time slot on there Tuesday nights where I play basically any video game that's not Zelda. I do a lot of streaming on my personal Twitch channel, and then I do a lot on Twitch. I also am a co-host on another Twitch show on another channel, Winecraft Wednesday, which is over at twitch.tv/WinecraftTV, where my co-hosts drink and rate wines while playing Minecraft. That's been probably my longest existing project at this point. So, yeah. Just Google Elias Thompson and filter out all the Boardwalk Empire references, and you'll find me.
Yeah, aside from Boardwalk Empire, he's got pretty good SEO.
I had better SEO before that show. This next show. I showed up in a Twitch chat recently with my username and someone said, "Hey, is your name a Boardwalk Empire reference?" I go, "No, it's my name." But I hate that show because of that question.
Well, strong feelings from the
I've never seen the show. I just hate that character name choice by the casting or writers or whatever.
And if you want to find me, the Twitter is at classy_Don. That's DON. You can find my RPG podcast at iTunes, at Podbean. Just enter in MyRPG Podcast. And once again, thank you for listening, and I will see you at the table.